Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Sorry. Hello, everybody. Good evening.
Oh, namaste.
Namaste. Right. Can you hear me? Is I just wanted to make sure that the audio is all right.
It's
And
audible,
everybody.
sir.
Okay.
Audio is okay.
Okay. Right. So everybody is here. So within 1 minute, we will start our distinguished speaker, Professor Dr. Prasanta Pattanaik has already joined. So I think let me say today's outline of 2 hours program. Our usually these things we usually call classes or sessions. Usually call. So usually the outline 2 hours outline is in such a way that first 1 hour is dedicated 1 hour or 70 minutes, 1 hour 10 minutes will be dedicated to speaker, distinguished speaker, and then there is a 5 to 7 minutes break for his rest or for his uh, for because for such a long time 1 hour and 10 minutes, so the speaker need to take rest for 5 to 7 minutes. At that moment, we'll prepare and discuss what are the points, what are the questions, and then rest of 50 minutes would be dedicated for Q&A session, question and answer session. So that is the usual format of our every class or session, whatever you like to call it. So it is 9 p.m. In my clock. So I'm starting with the introductory remarks, and then I'll humbly invite our distinguished speaker, Professor Pattanaik. So this is welcome everybody. I'm very delighted to welcome you all here at the beginning class or class 1 or inaugural class. The class will be conducted by our distinguished speaker is Dr. Prasanta Pattanaik. So, and as you know, the Banglar Pathshala Foundation has its 14th member study circle titled Individual Well-Being and Social Welfare Study Circle. Dear distinguished Professor Prasanta Pattanaik sir and the participants and friends, a very warm good evening to you all. It is my profound honor and joy to welcome you to the very first session of the Individual Well-Being and Social Welfare Study Circle organized by the Banglar Pathshala Foundation. As many of you know, on September 6th, we had the rare and historic privilege of having Nobel laureate Professor Ahmed inaugurate this study circle. His gentle yet profound words reminded us that true development cannot be measured merely by income or happiness, but by whether people have the freedom and capabilities to live lives they have reason to value. That vision is the guiding light of this entire 6 months journey. Tonight marks the beginning of our academic voyage, 13 sessions, including the inaugural and closing sessions, spread over 6 months, with participants from 16 different countries, all bound by a shared curiosity and commitment to rethink what individual well-being and social welfare truly mean in our time. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce our distinguished convener and speaker for this inaugural session, Professor Professor Dr. Prasanta Pattanaik of the University of California, Riverside, USA. Professor Pattanaik is not only one of the world's foremost scholars of welfare economics and social choice theory, but also the architect of this very program. Uh, Despite personal health challenges and family responsibilities, he has tirelessly and selflessly prepared the entire syllabus of this study circle out of love for knowledge and for the younger generation. His dedication is a shining example for all of us. Tonight's lecture, titled Utility-Based Conception of Individual Well-Being in Welfare Economics, will take us to the very roots of welfare economics, exploring the permissions, exploring the promises, complexities, and limitations of utility as a foundation of well-being. The readings suggested by Professor Pattanaik have already set the stage for us, and I am confident that his reflections will open up new pathways of thought and discussion. Before I hand over to respected Professor Pattanaik, sir, let me take a moment to thank each of you for joining us in this global knowledge exchange. Your presence is what transforms this program into a living dialogue, one that bridges countries, disciplines, and generations. With great respect and deep anticipation, let us begin. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished teacher and convener, Professor Dr. Prasanta Pattanaik, sir, for tonight's lecture. Thank you. Now I'll briefly introduce him, though there is no need for such introduction because he is already eminent scholar by his name. But some of our participants may not have aware of his background. So let me very briefly introduce him. Professor Prasanta Pattanaik is an Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of California, Riverside. The area of his research include welfare economics and the theory of social choice, stochastic preference and choice, fuzzy preference and choice, choice under non-probabilistic uncertainty, and the theory of international trade. He has published numerous papers, including some of the very famous journal articles, along with Professor Ahmed. And recently, his book, he and Professor Yang Sheng Su's both edited book published Multidimensional Well-Being, and many more journals he has published, and is the author and co-author of several books. So without further ado, may I humbly request Professor Prasanta Pattanaik sir to begin his lecture. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Javed, for your very kind introduction. My greetings to everybody who is participating in this program. Now, I would like to start by talking a little bit about the exact position of this particular topic that I'm going to talk on in the context of welfare economics. In the context of welfare economics in general, and also in the context of the tradition of utilitarianism. Why are we interested in the notion of an individual's well-being? This is a question of considerable importance for economists and philosophers working on normative issues relating to judgments about a society's welfare and the choice of social policies. Now, there are two distinct aspects of this general area, that is, social welfare judgments and social choice. One is at an individual level. If I am, for example, an individual who is trying to judge the welfare of the society, what are the criteria? What are the relevant things on the basis of which I shall consider the welfare of the society? Second, there is also another issue. After we have discussed how we should judge the welfare of the society at the level of an individual observer who is looking at the society and is considering how shall I judge the welfare of the society. There is also a second issue. After everything has been discussed, argued about, how does the society decide what policy it would adopt? In other words, the question of social decision. Now, these are sometimes confused, but they are distinct issues. One is a matter of an individual's personal judgment about the society's welfare, which of course will influence his opinion if he is voting for the society. The second thing is not concerned with an individual's welfare judgment. The second thing is, when we have discussed everything and we have expressed our opinion, how does the society make the final choice of a policy? Now, this is a matter of voting. What method do I use in order to aggregate the different votes that we cast? The two are very distinct issues. In one case, I'm considering the individual's judgment about social welfare. In the second case, I'm aggregating the opinions of people so as to arrive at a decision for the society. After the votes have been cast, how do I decide what policy needs to be adopted? Do I do it by simple majority voting method? Do I do it by some more complex voting method? That's the question of the decision-making mechanism. Now, the two have been often confused, but they must be kept completely separate. Now, what I am talking about now, that's about the question of individual welfare judgment. We are arguing with each other what should be the relevant criteria for the society to decide whether an individual's welfare has gone up or gone down. Okay. Now, then this is one aspect. The second thing is necessary to remember that when I'm talking about the utilitarian tradition or utilitarian view of an individual's well-being, I'm not talking about utilitarianism necessarily. I'm talking about the utilitarian view of individual's well-being. I may have one view of individual's well-being. For example, I may think individual's well-being as utility, which I shall explain presently. But even if I identify the individual's well-being with his utility, the question still remains. Do I consider only individual's well-being when I decide about society's welfare, when I consider how I judge society's welfare? That need not necessarily be the case. Now, individual's well-being is one of the basic considerations that we take into account when forming our judgment about society's welfare. Now, that's one aspect of utilitarianism, but then that may not be the only aspect that I need to consider. One can think of a society where we all agree about individuals' well-being, but after that, do I take into account something more than the individual's well-being? So individual's well-being interpreted as utility, that's the basic factor, and that is the reason is we do not normally think of society's welfare without necessarily considering individual well-being. But is individual well-being the only thing that we consider? Not necessarily. I can believe in the utilitarian conception of individual well-being, but I may think when I go into the discussion of society's welfare, I may like to take into account other things besides the individual well-being. Now, I'm not considering that aspect at all. I'm just considering how do I judge individual's well-being. The other question is individual well-being the only thing that I take into account in making my judgment about society's welfare? I'm not talking about that at all. So I'm talking only about one particular feature of utilitarianism viewed as a broad philosophy for taking social action or for judging society's welfare. But I'm not committing myself to the other aspect. Is individual well-being the only thing that I take into account or something more? That I'm not discussing today at all. So I have located my talk today in two respects. I'm considering society's well-being, and because I'm considering society's well-being and individual well-being, we think is an essential consideration for this judgment. So I'm talking about individual well-being, not without necessarily committing myself to what is generally known as utilitarianism. I'm considering only one element of utilitarianism. So then, after that, I go on to consider certain other things. So now, what are the utility-based conception of individual well-being? The utility-based notion of individual well-being simply identifies individual well-being with her utility. So it is identifying the individual's well-being with her utility without going into necessarily into other issues relating to utilitarianism as a broad philosophy. But what is utility? How do we interpret utility? Now, utilitarianism as a philosophy of public action or public society's welfare, now that has evolved over nearly 250 years, starting with Bentham, then subsequently a whole host of utilitarians, and then a conspicuous name, John Stuart Mill. You probably have heard about him. I'm talking about the students mainly. If there's any non-student, I'm not referring to in a conditioning fashion. I'm just talking about students. That's why I'm lecturing exactly I would lecture in a classroom. So many of the students would have heard about John Stuart Mill, the famous philosopher who wrote about utilitarianism and also about individual liberty. So John Stuart Mill, it has evolved, and subsequently also Jevons and others, it has evolved nearly over 250 years. Over those 250 years, there are a lot of different sets of utility-based conceptions of individual well-being. Bentham identified utility-based conception of well-being, his conception well-being with various things. He almost took all of them to be identical, but we tend to distinguish them. Bentham talked about pleasure and absence of pain, about happiness, about preference, satisfaction, about a whole lot of things. He tended to identify them all together. But subsequently, there have been further developments. Subsequently, individual well-being has been identified in the utilitarian tradition with an individual's happiness. Now, still further down, individuals' well-being has been identified with the satisfaction of individuals' preferences. There is a difference. Identifying individuals' utility with happiness and identifying individuals' utility with the individual's preference satisfaction. And they are not necessarily the same. Now, I would consider mainly the two notions. One is utilitarian notion of individual well-being as utility interpreted as happiness. The second is utilitarian notion of individual well-being as the individual's utility identified with preference satisfaction. It's the second one, utility as the satisfaction of the individual's preferences, that has been widely used in conventional welfare economics. Particularly in microeconomic theory, in welfare economics, we typically talk about individuals' preference satisfaction, though more recently, many people have started talking about the individual's happiness also. But both the notions are closely related, and many of the objections to the notion of individual utility is happiness, many of the criticisms carry over to the notion of individual utility as satisfaction of the individual's preferences. So instead of continuously talking about happiness and individual's preference side by side, I shall concentrate on the notion of satisfaction of the individual's preference as the interpretation of utility. But more or less similar things can be said about notion of utility as individual's happiness. So I'm focusing my talk on the satisfaction of individuals' preferences. Okay. Now, in this context, I shall mention various criticisms that have been leveled against this particular notion of utility as the satisfaction of individuals' preferences. Now, many philosophers and economists have leveled criticisms against this. We don't have the time to discuss all of it, but I shall present only a few of them, some of them particularly, which have led to the more recent development of the so-called functioning and capability approach, thanks to the important contributions of Amartya Sen and Professor Martha Nussbaum. So I'm going to concentrate on a few of these limitations that have been pointed out, especially those limitations which have a direct link to the conceptions of Professor Sen and Martha Nussbaum. Okay. Now, first, there are some limitations which have been pointed out by utilitarians themselves. The utility-based conceptions of individual utility, those who have advocated it, they themselves have pointed out some of the limitations. Let me take up one of them first. The basis of utility as preference satisfaction, that depends on certain implicit assumptions, which utilitarians have explicitly stated, particularly John Harsanyi, a Nobel laureate in economics. He has explicitly stated that in order to consider the satisfaction of individual preferences as the individual's well-being, you need to make an assumption that the individual is well informed. If the individual doesn't have certain important bits of information, then we would find it difficult to identify his preference satisfaction as the individual's well-being. Take, for example, the following. Now, suppose we are talking about many of the complex products that you find in the market today. Complex products in the field of medicine, in the field of financial contracts, different types of financial contracts. In the context of medicine, there are a whole lot of medicines, non-prescription medicines, which do not require any prescription to buy in the pharmacy. You go on over the counter, you ask for the medicine and it will be handed over to you, because no regulation has been prescribed for that sort of medicine. No medical tests have been conducted by the doctors, qualified doctors. How does the consumer, ordinary consumer like me, who doesn't know much about medicine, what has been confirmed by the doctors and what has not been confirmed by the doctors. If I go to buy one of these non-prescription medicines, how do I decide? I do not know. All that I've seen are a whole lot of advertisements on the television or the radio. I've listened to it about the efficacy of these medicines. But I do not know to what extent those exaggerated claims often made over the advertisements are justified or not. And if the government has not issued any regulation about this, that I need a prescription, I can't go to a doctor and ask, give me a prescription. So I buy, thinking that, okay, I've seen so many good things about this prescriptive medicine, non-prescription medicine, and it is probably good. And I'm prepared to spend a lot of money on the basis of this just persuasive advertisements. Then would I say that this consumer's preference necessarily serves his best interest? If he had the information, would he be buying this medicine? Probably not. If I did know the information, I may not buy it. In this case, would I consider buying this medicine on the basis of my preference, probably misinformed preference, over the counter, and that will serve my best interest? Even Harsani, who is a confirmed utilitarian, he says that the consumer or the individual should be reasonably informed. There should be adequate information, if not outright wrong information. There should be adequate information. Let me take another example, because that is increasingly a problem. Now, the market, financial market, has a lot of complex products. These complex products are legal. They may be legal. There may not be anything illegal about them. But an ordinary person like me, who is neither an accountant nor does he know very much about these complex financial products. For example, some of the products that are being sold in the American financial market, particularly called reverse mortgage, various types of complex annuities, various types of insurance. I don't know the legalities. So I tend to take into account the advertisements, which are continuously I'm seeing over the television, and I would be swayed by that. Now, then, not knowing the details of the financial contract into which I'm entering, if I choose something purely on the basis of persuasive advertisements, and proper financial expert would be able to find out whether it is good or not, but I have not taken any advice. Would my preference reflect my best interest? Probably not. So that is another example of preferences which are based on inadequate and possibly completely wrong information, just on my impression. And would that be called the individual's well-being? Now, we may not agree. These are questions of information. But information is not the only problem. I may have complete information, but there are other problems, even admitted by the confirmed utilitarians, among them John Harsani. Now, preference may be context dependent. If I'm sitting at home and I'm considering carefully, should I eat certain types of food and drink? I decide that no, it is not in my best interest. I decide that my best interest will be to completely avoid these foods and drinks because these may destroy my health. That's my considered preference. But consider what is happening when next day I go to the office and we are going for lunch from the workplace with several friends and colleagues. I end up by ordering exactly the type of foods and drinks which at home I had decided I would not touch. What is happening? Preference has become context dependent. Depending on the context, I express one type of preference or another type of preference. Now, which preference would you give priority to? Does the preference that I decided upon after careful consideration, thinking about it in the quiet of my home, I'm not getting swayed by any impulsive preference. I'm deciding that these foods and drinks are completely bad for me. Do I give priority to that preference in deciding my well-being? Or should we give priority to his preference at the lunch with friends, where I end up ordering precisely the foods and drinks which I decided to avoid? Does that preference express my best interest and my well-being? Now, these impulsive preferences, one would feel, should be discounted to some extent in deciding my well-being. But it ranges a whole lot of philosophical problems. Let me tell you what sort of philosophical problems. Now consider another type of situation, though particularly in the context of education. Now, if I am educated, I have one type of preference. If I'm not educated, I have another type of preference. When I'm not educated, I have not been exposed to certain types of thinking, certain other aspects, besides certain simple aspects of life. I may not have been exposed to that. When one of the purposes of education is to train my thinking, how do I look at the different aspects of life? Do I look at just the simple preference satisfaction, or do I consider other aspects? Now, consider one example. That was one of my favorite professor's example. He said, when I decided I shall not stop my education at the school, I decided to go for higher education. I probably would have said that, look, all these different types of literature, thinking about John Donne, thinking about T.S. Eliot, or thinking about W.B. Yeats. What is this? This is complete waste of time. Why don't I settle down to certain more relevant aspects of life? But then he said, you study for 4 years or you go for master's degree in English literature. And after that, you have changed your preference. You have changed your preference that, okay, besides, of course, I have to consider the basic aspects of life, but also there are other things which I need to consider. In other words, he said, your preference would have been more refined, more discriminating. Now, which one would you take as the guide for your well-being? Because you have to decide about your course of action. Do I go to the university or do I not go to the university? Now, after going to the university, my preference has changed. So if I'm talking about social policies, which preference should I talk about in this context? Do I consider the preference after education or before education? In particular, many of the decisions about social policy involve this issue. When we decide whether we shall provide higher access to higher education on a wide scale, we shall make it available to large proportion of the population. Now, which preference should I take into account? Once I adopt a policy that will change the person's preference. So which one should be given priority in the context of social decision? Which preference should I consider as reflecting the individual's well-being? Now, similar sort of things have been discussed also. It is not only just in the context of education. Consider another example from John Stuart Mill. As you know, John Stuart Mill was a confirmed, self-proclaimed utilitarian, but occasionally he was also concerned about this issue. He has a famous parable, the parable of Socrates, the pig, and the fool. Now, let me read out a quotation which I have not given in my note that I circulated. The quotation is from Utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. The implication is Socrates is a better judge of welfare, an individual's welfare, than the pig or a fool. Because Socrates has thought about various aspects of life. He has studied very carefully this issue, and therefore he thinks that only satisfying one's basic physical needs is not necessarily the only type of satisfaction, whereas the pig and the fool are of a different opinion. So he asked the question, which well-being as preference satisfaction, which type of preference should be taken into account before thinking about it and reflecting about it, studying it, the preference that I form, Socrates, or before anything has been studied by the individual, particularly the pig in this context, the pig's desire for more and more food and nothing else. So which satisfaction do I consider the criterion for well-being, individual's well-being? Now, this has been challenged by various people, and I myself have some sympathy with the pig. If the pig has not been exposed to various types of things, various types of experiences, then how do I, if he knows only the pleasure of the food or the preference for food as the only relevant thing, how do I discount his satisfaction? He's completely satisfied only with food. How do I discount his satisfaction for what? On what basis? Is that reasonable? This question will again come up later on. But for the moment, I shall record this reservation of John Stuart Mill and pass on to the next issue. I'm looking at the time, I should not overshoot. Okay, then consider another very important type of objection. And this is particularly important because some of the crucial strands of thinking in the context of functioning and capability approach have elaborated this point to a great extent. And in particular, Professor Sen has emphasized this aspect again and again, the point that I'm going to put to you. This is called adaptive preference, or the so-called sour grape phenomenon. You know the parable of the fox who jumped and jumped for the grapes, and he could not reach the grapes. He found that if he sort of feels too dissatisfied because he could not reach the grapes, he's just spoiling his own happiness, his own satisfaction. So he decided that grapes are not worth having. I am perfectly satisfied without the grapes, so why was I jumping for the grapes? It's not worth doing that. Now, this is called adaptive preference. What the individual is doing here, the individual, the fox, is he desires something, the grapes, but is unable to reach it. He finds that it is not feasible for him to reach it. So he decides that grapes are sour. Therefore, it is not worth having. It is much better that I remain satisfied with whatever I have. I don't have to jump for the grapes. Now, this has psychological basis, even in the context of individuals, not necessarily the fox of the parable, even in the context of individuals, sometimes individuals do this. Now, consider in many societies, there are groups, whether based on caste, or whether based on religion, or whether based on sex, they have been discriminated against for a long time, over centuries. Over centuries. Now, when you are discriminated against over centuries, like the fox, you have two options. You can go on feeling discontented. You can go on thinking what you don't have and feel completely miserable. Or you can decide that it's not worth doing this, that I shall prune down my own desires, that if I'm feeling so miserable by aspiring so high, why do I aspire so high? I would rather be contented with whatever I have, those few pleasures that I have, those few preferences that I have. If I can satisfy them and remain contented, I shall be better off. So why have such aspirations? This is sometimes called in development economics the aspiration deficiency. Whether you call it by the name aspiration deficiency, or whether you call it sour grape phenomenon, whether you blame the individual for doing this or whether you don't blame the individual for doing this, it immediately raises an issue. If the individual is deliberately, consciously or subconsciously, he may not be doing it consciously, he may be doing it subconsciously. But if after continuous disappointment, continuous failure to have his preferences, his aspirations for certain better things of life thwarted, then if he sort of cuts down his desire and decides that he will consciously or subconsciously, it need not necessarily be a conscious decision, it may be subconscious decision, then should we decide the individual's preference satisfaction as the measure of his well-being? It is difficult to decide this issue. If I don't go by his desires, what shall I go by? Because in the utilitarian tradition, there is no answer, because we are going either by happiness or by preference satisfaction or by consideration of pleasure and absence of pain. If I'm going by these considerations, and if we decide that we should not go by these considerations, what are then the other considerations that can figure there? Now, that is one issue that also has to be faced by the functioning and capability approach. We shall see this in the functioning and capability approach. You will hear from the other lectures. But at this stage, I'm not going into that, but this is a major consideration in this context, that this sour grape phenomenon or this adaptive preference causes a very important limitation of the interpretation of well-being, individual well-being, as the individual's preference satisfaction. You may satisfy all the preferences that he has, but what if he has cut down his own preferences, the self-curtailed preferences? Should I go by that criterion? We have to come back to that. Okay? That is the third important reason I would like to consider. Now then here, next thing I shall take up, the sense criticism of the conception of an individual well-being in terms of preference satisfaction of the individual's preferences. And I guess much of what Sen has said, Professor Martha Nussbaum also probably would agree. That's my feeling about what he will not like about the utilitarian conception of individual well-being. Now, consider the criticism. Now, first, the criticism runs in terms of the focus on individual well-being as preference satisfaction or happiness. But there are certain things of life which go beyond that, preference satisfaction. Now, preference satisfaction is a state of the mind. Happiness is a state of the mind. Is happiness the state of the mind or preference the state of the mind? Should I focus exclusively on that? Yes, happiness is an important consideration. And most people, even after careful reflection, would say that happiness is an important consideration. But is that the only thing that I consider? Or similarly, preference satisfaction is an important consideration. If my preferences are thwarted all the time, then it is difficult to say that my well-being is high. But is preference satisfaction the only thing that I should consider? Now, here, Sen would say no. What is it ignoring? It is ignoring certain physical aspects of living. Besides the state of the mind, there are certain physical conditions of a person's living. Now, what are the physical aspects that Sen may be thinking of? One type of physical concept is very the basic physical need. It is completely distinct from the question of whether I desire it or don't desire it. It's the basic question of whether I feel happy about it or don't feel happy about it. There are certain physical conditions which are important. Now, if a person is ill-felt, if the person is suffering from social discrimination, all the time, is even if it is not referring to happiness and preference satisfaction, would I not like to consider it? That's the basic question he's asking. Now, there are several other people who have raised similar issues. Let me mention one of them, Scanlon, the philosopher Scanlon. He also talked about something called urgency of desire. Okay, if you are talking about desires, you should talk about desires, to what extent desires are being satisfied. But he had the notion of urgency of desire. Now, urgency of desire is not something like my desiring something intensely or not intensely. Urgency of desire is something closely related to this notion of physical conditions. Now, hunger, whether I am desiring intensely for food or not, that's not necessarily the only consideration. Without hunger, I shall perish. It's a physical condition of my living. Now, should I not take into account, independent of the individual's degree of preference for this food, reasonable amount of food? There are other things, basic shelter. Is that also a question of only preference? Without basic shelter, I shall perish in a cold country. Or in a hot country also, I may perish just by being exposed to extreme heat. Now, should I only consider the individual's preference here? Or should I consider the fact that without these basic physical conditions being taken into account, without this being satisfied, the individual will perish altogether? So indirectly, he is also referring to, he is not calling it physical conditions, but he is calling it the urgency of the desire. The urgency is completely different from the intensity of preference. It is completely different from happiness or unhappiness. It is something relating to the physical existence itself. And probably it is something similar which people who emphasized basic needs, it is not that they would have probably, if you had put it to them, they would have said, well, we would completely ignore a person's happiness. We would completely ignore a person's preference satisfaction. But they were thinking of something different, the pure physical urgency or the pure physical condition of an individual's living, without which the individual may not be able to live at all. So they were considering this to be basic needs, the need for shelter, the need for food. So the same thing is guiding their thinking too, though they didn't put it in purely philosophical terms. Now then, Professor Sen and Professor Martha Nussbaum took it to the next level to bring in many of these things as essential aspects of human living. But then the next question was raised by Sen, that if I am trying to go beyond individual desire or preference, then what should I appeal to? This notion of urgency or this question of physical conditions. How do I judge that, physical conditions? And he said that in order to do that, we have to go beyond the pure desire and preference to consider what the individual values in our life. Now, valuing something is not the same thing as preferring something. I value a lot of things which I don't prefer. I prefer a lot of things which I don't value. In other words, preference and desires don't necessarily coincide with my values. So should we consider the more basic question of, if I want to go beyond desires and preferences, what shall I take into account? Now, he said, it's the things that individual values in our life. Now, that raises questions to which I shall come back in my next lecture later on, when I talk about some limitations of the functioning and capability approach. If I want to go beyond individuals, go beyond desires and preferences, which I agree, we should go beyond that, then we want to consider individual values in our life. Now, the things that he values, now whose values? The things that individual I values for in judging his well-being, or the things that individual K values in judging whole life. If different individuals value different things in their life, I'm talking about value. No longer I'm talking about preference. I'm not talking any longer about desires. Then how do I judge the individual values and apply them to whose values are these? The individuals or some impersonal set of values decided by the society? Now, I would like to express my strong reservations later on about the type of difficulty that arise when you take into account, if you take into account only the individual's own values in judging his well-being and another individual's own values in judging her well-being, it raises extremely complicated issues, which I shall point out later on. Now, I have no intention of going into that, so I shall stop with that about sense criticism. And one thing I would like to tell my students, when we are talking about these alternative approaches, we are not necessarily talking about adopting one approach or another. Each approach has its own strength. Each approach has its own weakness. Each approach has its own limitations. We need to know about the limitations of each one of these approaches. Otherwise, if without being aware of the limitations, if we go over to adopt one particular approach unconditionally, without looking at the difficulty that it raises, we may run into very serious problems. In fact, we may run into a problem of, when we are taking into account social decisions, we may run into the problem of what may be called majoritarianism. Whatever the majority decides by taking vote, that's the only thing that is relevant. We may run into that. We do not necessarily have to run into that, but there is a strong temptation to run into that. So these are things to which I would come back later on. Now, another thing I would like to point out, that one can possibly take into various bits from different approaches and try to combine them. Does that create any problem? Again, one has to talk about that. One doesn't necessarily get persuaded by one particular approach. One has to look at the limitations of what I'm trying to say. And that can be done only by ourselves. The person who is considering, I said, there are two types of aspects of welfare economics. One is which goes into the question of an individual's judgment about society's welfare. I am concerned with that. Another aspect is the decision-making of the society. Shall I go by majority decisions after voting, or shall I go by some other rule? That's the question of social decision-making after voting. Now, I'm not going into that. But there is a strong temptation that if any individual approach is causing too much a problem and we are adopting that, we may say that, okay, go over to the majority decision voting, whatever the majority decides. But that would be, in my opinion, that would be fatal. That's why I would like to urge all my students to think completely critically. And this critical thinking can come only from you. Because you have to consider how you would value the society's welfare. You would have to listen to the argument that economists have given, that philosophers have given, but after listening to all their arguments, ultimately, it is your opinion, your assessment which matters, because that's the only thing that we have, our own brain. We cannot substitute anybody else's brain as a replacement for our own brain. I would like to strongly urge my students to look very carefully about how you feel about this. That's the important thing. I shall stop here. I'm stopping a little bit earlier than I decided to stop. I thought I shall talk for 60 minutes or 70 minutes, but I shall stop here. I shall leave it to probably more time for the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your very detailed and very engulfing presentation. Very beautiful presentation. And I'm sure that we didn't have much idea about the choice and preference as such a detailed account of explanation. So thank you very much for your uh, uh, very beautiful and very detailed analytical presentation. Thank you so much, sir. So I think, sir, you will take a 5 to 7 minutes break, right? Okay.
If
So,
you want me to, if I want me to take more time in talking, I
yes.
can. But I have covered all the points that I wanted to cover.
Yes, yes. Uh, 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 Actually, for we have heard from you around 50 minutes or so. So I think you take some rest, 5 to 7 minutes. Uh, then I will, in the meantime, I will take questions and cues. Whoever wanted to pose question in written form or uh, verbally. So I will queue them up, and then after 5 to 7 minutes rest, we will come back to. All right, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So, as I said earlier, that uh, at the beginning of the lecture, I have uh, I have said to you that Professor Pattanaik sir will take a 5 to 7 minutes break after his lecture. So, what do you think? How can we utilize this time? I think we could now a, a list of uh, uh, question cues whoever have uh, questions to ask. So I think uh, for the simple reason, for the simplicity, we can make a queue by if you could raise your hand through your uh, screen, so I can make it. Maruf, can you help me?
Yeah, Ronie, so I think we can take the questions verbally, and also participants can also post their questions on the chat box here. So either way
Yes,
it works. Yeah.
yes.
And I think people might need a few minutes break as well, so we can start again in 5 minutes or so, if
Sure,
that
sure.
works. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
yes, sure.
Thank you.
Is it possible to ask the question verbally?
Of course.
Okay.
Why not?
Okay. Just I want to ask this simple question. When the things are changing with the context and with the assumptions and with the individual mind, that means if he or she is educated or he have the detailed knowledge or he is well aware or he have a spirituality exposed to the deeper part of the meaning. So deeper part of the if he has the exposure on the different angles or views, so he have a different perception about the concept. So if the concept varies with the observation and perception, how would you benchmark when you are to implement the thing in the global context?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm sorry, I
Understand?
could not note down the question. Can I request you to ask this question directly once Professor rejoins,
Okay.
if you don't mind?
Sure,
Thank you.
sure.
Um,
Professor Ronie, I also have one question to Professor Pattanaik.
sure.
Shall I ask him directly or I have to note it here?
So, uh,
Ronie bhai,
anything,
I think,
any way you
sorry
like.
to interrupt. For the verbal questions, how about we wait for Professor Pattanaik to join and then we can ask directly.
Yes,
I
sure.
think that will be
Okay.
better
That's
use of
Thank
time.
you. Thank you.
Thanks for your understanding.
But we can put a queue for a more disciplined way.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that
I'll taking care of that. No worries.
okay. So 1, 2, 3. If you put the queue,
I don't know how
and
to raise the hand in this platform.
Marat, can you help him?
Yeah, let me show you just one moment.
Okay.
So you see the on your Zoom screen, there's a bunch of icons in the middle of the like bottom middle, and there's one icon called React. Do you see that?
React.
Yeah. If you click on
Whiteboard apps, docs.
yeah, it's next to participant and chat.
Okay, next to participant chat. Yes.
Do you React? If you click on that, it will pop up another box, and there you'll see the option to raise a hand. Yeah.
But
Raise
as soon as you finish your question, then
Yeah.
you have to put down your hand.
Okay.
Yeah. 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 Do you see that?
I haven't got it yet.
Your
Okay.
I
screen
don't know what.
appears as
I'm in the mobile. That is the
Oh, okay. That could be a challenge. Yeah. But yeah, wherever you see the React icon or option, you will find the raise a hand option on inside that.
Is it the reaction what I have?
I will.
The one you are using right
Some of
now,
my
it's
friends has
Yes.
joined. Sorry, some of my
Yes,
friends
I
has
think I got
joined.
it.
My friend and my classroom mate, Mohammed Ibrahim, is appearing here. So I think, Ibrahim bhai, are you there?
Yes, Ronie bhai, I am here.
So I will to find this question answer session more interesting, to be more interesting. You can pose your question or any queries or from your experience from PKSF. Did you hear?
Nice.
Uh,
And I think we are not hearing from him. Can we
okay.
take another minute to make that announcement we had regarding lecture in Bangla or discussion in Bangla following the session? Yeah.
Okay. So just my another friend Altaf Hussein said, Altaf Hussein, are you there? Altaf Hussein? Okay, Sir has rejoined. Sir, are you ready now for
Yes,
the
I'm ready.
Q&A session? So we have a couple of questions here. First is Mr. Mohammed Mainuddin Patwari from Dhaka School of Economics. He wants to ask a question. Mr.
Hello,
Mainuddin
sir.
Patwari. Yes.
Yes. Hello, sir. Good evening, sir. It's nice to meet with you, sir. I've heard a lot about you, but never had the opportunity to talk with you or to in live sessions. Thank you so much for your time and your precious moments for us. So just I had a question. I have a question. The question is like that. So we are considering utilitarian views uh, from different perspectives, like that are varies with the perspectives and different dimensions and the education and the background and the mind and the depth of the person. So the concept varies. When regard in case of the global perspective or in case of the different cultural perspective, when we want an alignment or the benchmark, or what should we consider at this moment? Because culture varies, the concept varies, and the evaluation techniques varies with the people. So how you suggest us, so for the alignment issue, what can be done and how it can be proceed, or how we can, because sometimes we need to resolve the conflict, or sometimes we need to move on a direction that where we can get the most uh, I mean, you want to majoritarianism, what you were like the voting, when you have to align all the people in the one umbrella, under one umbrella, what should be the our approach, and what should be our guideline for this type of alignment?
Okay, can I
I don't know whether I can.
So, sir, I think we can take multiple questions and then you address a bunch of questions at once. Or
Yeah.
And the second question was raised by uh, Professor Kishore Khanna. Can you just unmute and pose the question?
Okay, thank you, Professor Ronie. Namaste, everyone. I'm Kishore Khanal from Kathmandu University. And today I'm very, very happy to be part of this lecture series. I have read a lot about Prasanta Pattanaik on Amartya Sen's writing. And presently I'm doing my research on quality of life of people based on Amartya Sen's capability approach. And my question is as following. Quality of life of a person depends on the preferences set up by an individual. Since we have context-dependent preferences, so does it imply that we have context-dependent quality of life of person? Similarly, do we have a adaptive quality of life based on adaptive preferences? Thank you.
Okay, thank
thank you for your
you.
question.
Thank you.
Any
Sir,
other question?
Sir, I think these two questions were early raised. So you can go for these if you like. And then we'll go for next question. Because nobody, there is no third question yet. We are waiting
Ronie bhai,
for.
sorry to interrupt. There are a couple of questions posted in the group chat here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So should we include that, sir?
Yeah, go ahead. If you
Okay,
like.
I can read it out for Professor Pattanaik. The
Yes.
first question we have is from in the group chat is from Mr. Mustafa Azad Kamal. He was asking, can value be defined by utility or any other alternative ways? Is there any other alternative ways to define it? So that was one question. The second one we have is from Su Ming Ku. The question is, we have discussed how to understand individual preferences in connection or not with well-being. But how should we think about and account for individual preferences that are harmful, for example, results in others' ill-being? Very good question. The final one we have is from Ms. Sabikun Nahar. She's asking, who should decide which functioning is or are most important for the well-being of minority groups? Should this responsibility lie with the state, the development agencies, or the communities themselves, especially in the context where marginalized groups have limited opportunities to express their preferences. And how can external actors and development policies effectively address the well-being of these groups without imposing external value judgment that may overlook their lived realities? Another very insightful question. So those were the questions we had. Thanks to the participants for posting it on the group chat.
Fantastic. It's absolutely fantastic, the question that have come up. In fact, they touch upon some of the most crucial issues about the functioning and capability approach. This question of whose values, how do I decide, etc. But let me take it up one by one. The first question is, how do we get an alignment of the different, call them opinions or judgments about society's welfare? How do we combine into one coherent set of values reflecting the society's, called the society's values? This is an extremely difficult issue. It is really talking about what is democracy, what is liberal democracy, and how do we find the values that we would like to follow in a liberal democracy. On the one hand, if policy has to be formulated, it has to be formulated on the basis of something, some consensus. But when we try to identify individual well-being with the values developed by the consensus, what are the pitfalls of that? Consider a society where there is a strong majority group. A strong majority group has one set of values. And then there is a minority group. Minority group has a different set of values. But nobody, if you take the majority voting decision, you may say that, okay, this is the majority voting decision, we have to go by that. But the question doesn't end there. The question is, should I leave everything to the majority decision method? Or are there areas where the majority's preference do not count? Are there areas where individuals' opinion should count? Consider the development of our civilization. Now think about the time of when in the American society, Emerson and other philosophers were talking about the values that should guide the society. And now, I presume that many of you are already familiar with, many of the students are already familiar with the work on the Walden Pond. Are you familiar with the things that were developed in Walden Pond by, let me get hold of the exact reference. Sure. Now, okay, since I don't have the exact reference, let me extend it to another context where I know the exact reference. Now, suppose we are talking about Tolstoy. We are talking about Gandhi. Suppose we are talking about the people who these days are talking about minimalist style of living. I know that in the context of a developing economy, talking about minimalist life philosophy is a rather sounds like a caricature. But even in even in an underdeveloped country, there are people who believe that they would like to live a simple life, relatively simpler life, where they emphasize some of the fundamental things which they think are valuable, like being in contact with nature, not going for excessive exaggerated styles of living which constitute the standard of the society. Now, this is definitely a minority group. There are not too many Gandhis have not been too many Gandhis or Tolstoys in our history. So consider their time. If they had listened to, if we had gone by the opinion of the majority, these people would have been considered to be completely, almost mad. But then do I go by the majority in deciding thinkers like this? In every society, every phase of history, there have been very small minority groups, individuals sometimes, whose thinking slowly changed the society. If we tend to completely ignore them, that no, their well-being has to be judged by the majority opinion and nothing but the majority. Now, what will that lead to? Complete ignoring the individual's dissenting opinion from the majority. It may be a democracy in the form of some notion of democracy by following a particular voting rule. Is that a liberal democracy? Is that a society where one would like to live, where the only thing that counts in deciding the person's well-being is just the majority's opinion? No other set of values matter. And what sort of danger also exposes the society to? So that's about the question that I shall raise about this alignment. Do we necessarily have to have this alignment in the context of deciding it as a matter of personal opinion about an individual's well-being? Do we necessarily conform to the majority's opinion? When we take the decision about social choice, we probably don't know anything better than that sort of majority decision method. But as a matter of philosophical thinking, as a matter of my personal judgment about the society's welfare, do I take into account only the majority's opinion? Or do I offer critical view of that majority's opinion? Because sometimes those critical views slowly influence the majority, and the majority becomes a minority, and the former minority thinking becomes the majority. Now, this probably I would like to take up a little more in detail when I talk about in my next lecture, which is after nearly, I don't remember when exactly is my next lecture, when I talk about some limitations of the functioning and capability approach, conceptual issues. But I shall just stop there about this alignment issue. Then the other question was, the second question, I'm sorry, I couldn't note down everything. The second question was Mr. Kishore
Khanal.
I'm sorry, can you kindly remind me of your...
Professor Kishore Khanal from Nepal.
Oh, okay. So should I repeat my question again, sir?
Yes.
Okay, Professor Pattanaik. My question is, quality of life of a person depends on the preferences set up by an individual. Since we have context-dependent preferences, so does it implies that we have context-dependent quality of life of a person? Similarly, do we have an adaptive quality of life based on adaptive preferences? This is my question. Thank you.
Yes. Now, when you said that it depends on the quality of the preferences, quality of life, I presume we are talking about individual well-being.
Yes, exactly.
Now, the criticism, in fact, is precisely that. If we talk about only preference satisfaction, preference is depending on the context. Which preference do I take into account? The individual's preference before he was educated, or the individual's preference after he is educated? Individual preference when the individual is the equivalent of John Stuart Mill's pig, or the individual's preferences when the individual is equivalent of, after considerable thinking, exposing himself to various sorts of opinions and thinking about it, when the individual has become a Socrates, whose preferences would refer to shall I take the individual's quality of life? We don't have any easy answer, only in terms of preference. To answer this question, utilitarianism doesn't have a very good answer to this question. That what type of person would I need to be in order to say that, okay, my judgment about the quality of life is better than the other person's judgment about quality of life. Now, Mill laid down the rule that somebody who has experienced everything, all these different aspects of life, is a better judge. He said that if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, different from Socrates, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison, that is Socrates, knows both sides. Socrates knows what satisfaction of preference is, as at the basic level, just physical satisfaction, or what satisfaction at a more advanced level, quote unquote advanced level, as taking into account careful thinking, after taking into account the various opinions, etc. That's basically the basic problem of utilitarianism. But it doesn't necessarily get completely solved by switching to value. Now think about it, which values are completely independent of other influences? My values, if I have grown up in a slum and I have never had the exposure, I didn't get education, I didn't get exposure to other people's thinking. Now I would have one type of preference, one type of value. If I have grown up in a different environment, being exposed to various influences, thinking about it, encouraged to think about it, I would have a different type of value. No, I shouldn't say preference, different type of value. Which values do I consider and why? Do I take any simple solution for this that I shall consider only the Socrates type of values? Or should I consider only the pig type of values or the fool's values? The same issue remains. Whose values? Do I give any credence to the values of minorities? Or do I give credence to values of minorities, but that would involve ignoring some of the values of the majority? We don't have anything called genetic values. The values are the product of the society, the evolution of the society, the values that we acquire in the process of growing up in one type of environment or another type of environment. Where do we stop? And if we allow for this difference of values, and we would say that, okay, I shall take into account this man's values as well as that man's values, that creates a particular type of formal difficulty, formal at the level of pure analytical level, that it leads to us to formal inconsistency. But that's a different issue. I shall take that into account. I shall discuss that in my second lecture, which I've called some conceptual issues in the function and capability approach. I shall discuss there. And then the third thing was sorry, I'm unable to remember all the questions. I should have taken one by one.
Yes.
Yeah, I can read the question one more time for you, sir. The question we had was, can value be defined by utility, or are there any other alternative ways to define it?
You can define it in such a way that preference will take into account happiness, or preference will take into account everything. But that will be some slight distortion of the ordinary language, the day-to-day language that we use. If we take out that we identify value as happiness or preference satisfaction, then the notion of happiness or the preference satisfaction has to be twisted considerably, where it is no longer recognized, can be recognized as our ordinary notion of happiness or preference satisfaction. So I guess if I talk about values instead of individual preference satisfaction or happiness, then these values have to be defined independently. If you identify that with preference satisfaction or with happiness, you are using the terms so broadly that they no longer resemble our ordinary language, which we may not like to do. That's why I believe that's a good justification why Professor Sen has not taken the approach of expanding the notion of preference or expanding the notion of happiness in such a way that will subsume values. And he's completely right about that, I believe. Have I answered your question?
Question was from Mr. Mustafa Azad Kamal. If you would like to respond to Sir's.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Just it was my very curiosity whether really can be measured by utility or not. So thank you very much for your comment.
Thank you.
Then there's another question. Who should decide? Was
yes,
that a question?
Yeah. Do you want me to read the question one more time for you, sir?
Yes, please.
Okay. So the next question was from Suming Ku. She was asking, we have discussed how to understand individual preferences in connection or not with well-being. But how should we think about and account for individual preferences that are harmful, for example, results in others' ill-being?
That's very important. I should have included that. In fact, one of the utilitarians whose name I mentioned, Nobel laureate John Harsanyi, he has explicitly mentioned that we must avoid the individual's antisocial preferences, taking into account his antisocial preferences. What he called antisocial preferences, presumably he has in mind something like what you have in mind, where the individual's preferences concentrate on harming some other group rather than promoting his own personal welfare. I think he had something like that in mind. Also, antisocial preference, I guess John Stuart Mill would have, I remember one of his statements that I can't give equal importance to the preference of the individual whose property it is to retain his property and the preference of somebody else who wants to steal that property. If I prevent him from stealing the property, then he will be intensely unhappy because he has been thwarted in his desire to steal the property. On the other hand, the individual we suppose we consider he has a right, he has rightfully acquired his property, then just going by preference satisfaction, he may have less intense preference for retaining his property than the individual who wants to steal it. But he said that the individual who wants to steal it, his preference should be completely ignored. He would call that sort of preference probably antisocial, which there are different types of preference and some preferences should count, some other types of preferences should not count. In fact, this was one of the basic themes of his subsequent book, his book on liberty. He talked about what sort of liberty one should have, what sort of liberty one should not have. So that's a very legitimate issue. What do we call antisocial? When we talk about antisocial in the sense of positively harming somebody else, somebody who wants to harm others, is that harm? Again, harm needs to be defined. What do I consider harm? Suppose I feel intensely unhappy to see the fact that somebody else has a different political ideology from mine. So I'm feeling unhappy. Now, should that unhappiness count as my reduction in my well-being? If I am sort of just unhappy because he has a different political ideology. I'm not talking about his ideology is causing any tangible harm to me, but just the existence of such an ideology causes me intense unhappiness. My satisfaction is going down considerably that I'm living in a society where somebody has a different ideology. Should that be taken into account? That's again extremely important decision. How do I decide what is antisocial or what is harmful? Now that needs discussion, further discussion. Let me again.
My friend, actually Suming is my friend of HDCA. Sue, are you there?
Yes, I am, Ronie. Thank you,
Yes.
Professor, for your response. And I was reminded of your earlier point that you made early in your lecture about Professor Sen's point that we should not forget or ignore physical conditions. And I thought in this example of preference that could cause others ill-being, as you say, an antisocial preference or antisocial choice, I wasn't thinking about property versus stealing property. I was thinking more about this example that is really at the front of everyone's mind right now in the US about the subjective preference for gun ownership versus the objective threat to children who are going to school every day, having to have a training of what to do if somebody comes to shoot them in their school. So there's subjective unhappiness at having guns controlled, but there's objective harm, which is being visited on many schools and in classrooms and causing deaths of children. So that was really what I had in mind. But the question really also in general, and I think you will probably cover it in your later lecture, covers that connection between the individual preferences and collective choices. But maybe that is for a longer discussion. And I thank you very much for your presentation, which was very clear, and also for your answer to my question.
Thank you. May I just make a statement to which I come back again and again. Whenever I teach a classroom, or not necessarily in a classroom, whenever talking to people, I remember a few lines from T.S. Eliot. The lines are, "We shall not cease from exploration, though the end of all our exploring will be to come back to the place where we started and know the place for the first time." So it is subject something like that. My point is, I'm not looking for the truth. I'm looking for various arguments for what I think to be the truth, arguments for and against it, what other people have claimed to the truth, for and against it. And there are plenty of people who do not believe that there is something called the truth. So our continuous discussion, is just leading us to the place where we started. What exactly should we do and know it for the first time? That these have so many different aspects. The discussion just is clarifying our thinking. It may not do anything more, and that doesn't satisfy the policymaker. He needs something concrete immediately. That may not satisfy the policymaker. But just thinking about the different points of view, the arguments for and against, is clarifying our thinking. And that's my point here. All that what we are trying to do in various lectures, are not only my lecture, in other people's lectures, everything is leading us to the place where we started and know the place for the first time. It's not that we have found the solution to every problem. We are just knowing the complexity of the problem for the first time. Thank you.
The last one.
Yeah, we had one more question, Professor Pattanaik.
Please.
This one I will read out. This came from Ms. Sabikun Nahar. She was asking, who should decide which functioning are most important for the well-being of minority groups? Should this responsibility lie with the state, development agencies, or the communities themselves, especially in contexts where marginalized groups have limited opportunities to express their preferences? And how can external actors and development policies effectively address the well-being of these groups without imposing internal Sorry, just change a little bit. Sorry, let me read the last part one more time. How can external actors and development policies effectively address the well-being of these groups without imposing external value judgments that may overlook their lived realities?
No, nobody can impose it on anybody, but they can just try to persuade. Continuous argument, continuous challenge of views, the ideas. They can continuously challenge it. But I don't see that external groups can impose it on society. No matter what the external groups feel about the society, my personal opinion would be we cannot impose it from outside the society. We can only persuade, we can give arguments, we can advance arguments for some things, against some things, but it cannot be imposed on the society. At least I would not like my society, whatever society I'm living in, to be imposed on by external agencies. We can only persuade them. We can express our opinion, give arguments. And at this stage, that's the best that an academic or a person who is thinking about these things can do. Not more than that, okay, we are the ultimate arbiter of the values.
Sabikun, you are there. So can you unmute and address directly to Dr. Pattanaik that are you satisfied with his question and his response?
Yeah, thank you so very much. Yeah, I got my answer, but my question was basically like this, the policies we are making for the minority groups, most of the cases we could find out that they actually what they want. But most of the time we can see that we overlook their desires, their preferences, what they actually want. So that was my questions, that how we could make a better policies or development policies that could really identify their problems, their preferences, their value judgments without I use the word impose specifically focusing on the policies that are not considering their value judgments in that term. Yeah, but I got my answer. Thank you so very much, Professor.
Now that's an extremely important issue. That you are thinking of preferences, but beyond preferences, even their values.
Absolutely.
Even, how do I impose my values on them? They may be happy with it, but they may not value certain things. Should I say that they should value these things? On what basis? I can only try to persuade. I can argue that your preferences are misguided, misinformed because of these reasons, or your preferences will have this sort of consequence. I can only argue about it, but I can't, beyond that, I can't impose on them. I can only put forth arguments. But I recognize the importance of the issue because ultimately it has to come to a policy choice. And at that stage, if minority groups' preferences are not being taken into account by the form of government which is there, and minority values are also not being taken into account by the form of government, there is nothing more that anybody from outside can do excepting just to continuously urge, give arguments. There is a limitation of what somebody who is thinking about these things can do. But thank you very much for your very perceptive questions. In fact, I like all the questions. They raise issues, precisely issues that I would like people to raise in the context of any approach. In the context of virtually every approach, some similar issues arise. I shall later on have the occasion to come back to the functioning and capability approach, but that should not be taken as my hostility towards the approach. It's just that each of these approaches is raising very, very difficult issues.
Thank you, sir. Ronie bhai, we have one more question in the group chat.
But before that, I want to make an announcement that that some of our friends and participants here is from Bengali. I myself included is a Bengali speaking community. So for Bengali speaking community, we are arranging a session tomorrow at the same time, 9 p.m. To discuss what Professor Pattanaik has pointed out in his discussion, that so far we understand in English language. We'll discuss collectively only the Bengali speaking community for a better understanding of further discussion, and with some vivid examples, and maybe read some of the parts of his own writings. So I think for Bengali speaking community, there is a thing tomorrow at 9. I'll send the Zoom details through your email. And then SAR's PowerPoint presentation will be shared too, also through you via your email. And there is a last announcement, another announcement, that is for today's topic. If you write a 3-pager writings and send it to me to email, I will form a jury board to evaluate those, and best 3 essays would be awarded for a small amount of prize money. That first prize would be for 2,000 taka, second prize would be 1,500 taka, and third prize would be 1,000 taka. I can calculate equivalent to dollar. So I'll write detail in email. Because our next class would be on 20th September. So before that, by 19th September, if you could submit your essays or small write-ups, 3-pager write-ups to me, and then we could sort out we could call, on the one hand, we could concretize your inputs that you have taken and your analytical elaborations, and also we could put some incentives to those who identify the problem or analysis more clear. So this would be three. Every session there will be 3 small prizes for your better motivation and aspirations. Thank you. So Maruf, go ahead for next questions.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. This is the last question we will be taking today. This is a 2-part question, and this was posted by Oscar G. So I'll read out the first part first and then get the response from Professor Pattanaik and then go to the second one. So the question is, thank you very much for your lecture. First question is, would you consider that the recent move to life satisfaction is better equipped to deal with the criticisms mentioned in your lecture, given that it involves a cognitive element to reflect about people's lives? So that's the first question, sir.
Okay, may I answer that, and before we go to the next question?
Yes, please, sir.
Okay. Yes, this is one of the things that has been suggested, and I have not given this in my reading list, but I have in mind particularly a concrete suggestion for this, pursuing this life satisfaction rather than preference on this day or that day or before education or after education and things like that. Instead, to talk about the general condition of life, how do I measure it? I shall probably send the exact reference if it can be given to people who participated in this session for their information. Can I do that? In a particular issue of the Journal of Human Development and Capability, there is an article suggesting precisely this, life satisfaction. That seems to me to be more promising in the sense that it avoids some of the difficulties that we face when we try to decide whose values I shall adopt in deciding the person's well-being, whether it is high or low. That may take into account and resolve, not entirely resolve, but at least provide a better option in terms of some of the problems. And in answer to your question precisely, yes, I think that's a promising line of inquiry, but we need much further work than has been done so far. Take into account life satisfaction rather than preference satisfaction, but preference for a particular object or a particular type of experience. And what is the next question? So, may I check with Javed if I send a particular reference, would it be possible to circulate among the participants?
Yes, of course.
And that will give a reference to one particular article which refers to life satisfaction as a possible type of criteria.
All right, sir. I'll circle. You send the email, I'll circle.
There is a second question.
Yeah, the second question is there. Oscar, I was talking on you on the sideline. Would you like to read out the second part of the question?
Yes, please.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much again for organizing this course. I am more than happy to join you from Mexico. And as I was saying, thank you very much for the lecture. The second part of the question, I was wondering to what extent should we be concerned that by dismissing these utility-based conceptions of individual well-being, or by posing these criticisms, there has been a shift towards an extreme focus on, especially on human needs, for example, basic needs or even basic capabilities, at the expense of some social relational needs, such as quality of relationships, belonging, love, empathy, cooperation, solidarity, etc. And I think my question is, do you think this is a valid worry, a valid concern, and how can we cope with this detraction from all of these relational needs? Thank you very much.
That's a very interesting question. Should we take into account other things? Definitely. The basic needs are, by the very name, basic. Most of them relate to physical aspects of life, physical conditions of living, what's then called the physical conditions of life. Hunger, shelter, maybe the social status, whether anybody is listening to me or not. But there are a whole lot of other values which are not coming within this basic framework. Now, in sociology, some sociologists used to distinguish between different types of needs. One is the basic level, the physical aspects. Next are social aspects. Next are moral aspects. So they distinguish between different layers. So what you are referring to are the other layers in the sociologist language. And I believe that we should take into account others because first thing, even in an extremely poor country, the basic needs are not the only things that people are concerned about. People value. There are other values. Second, let's hope that someday these very poor countries also will become reasonably developed. And at that stage, they again have to face the same problem. Our basic needs have been satisfied. Now, what are the other needs? So we need to discuss that. We don't have to wait until we become developed in the underdeveloped economies, until we become developed, to confront these questions, at least intellectually. Even if our basic needs take much of our energy now, we have to face these other questions. And even in a poor country, where is a poor country where people don't value their social relations? I don't know of any poor country. They value certainly these basic physical conditions improving. But is there any country where people don't value the social relations, how they integrate with the community and things like that? I don't think there is any even poor country. So we need to take into account these issues. And the other day, we listened to Professor Alkar's lecture.
Yes.
And when she's talking about gross national happiness, many of the aspects that she was discussing relate to these other values, which are not necessarily concerned with physical conditioning or the physical aspects of life, which are concerned with the society, what sort of spiritual values I have. So they are certainly very, very important. And the other thing is, we may not be able to measure these things exactly, but measurability may be a necessity in science. But measurability is not necessarily the only virtue in social sciences. There are a lot of things which we cannot measure, but at least we should be talking about them. So even though we cannot measure them precisely, we need to talk about these concerns.
So, Oscar,
yes, thank you very much. I appreciate the response. Thank you.
So my friend Sue has written T.S. Eliot's Little Gidding from Four Quartets, one of also my favorite poem that I repeatedly recite in my house. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Through the unknown, remembered gate when the last of earth left to discover is that which was the belonging at the source of the longest river, the voice of the hidden waterfall, and the children in the apple tree not know, because not looked for, but heard, half heard, in the stillness between two waves, the sea. So that is the poem of T.S. Eliot.
Those are some of my most favorite lines in Four Quartets.
Yes. So we have 9 more minutes to go. So my friend from HDCA, Indrani Sigmani, is there. Indrani, do you have any question? Indrani, you are there? Please unmute and.
Sorry, I
Yes.
was on mute. I don't have a question at the moment, but I just want to say that I really, really appreciated the lecture. It was just very clear and just very easy to digest. Thank you so much, Professor Pattanaik.
You are welcome. Thank you very much.
That was amazing.
And Anu George, are you there? Anu
Yes, sir.
George?
Yes,
Yes.
yeah. Thank you
Yes.
so much. I too don't have right now any question, but I will read and think about all that I heard during the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You are welcome. Thank you.
So, thank you. Sir, I think, Maruf, what would you suggest?
I think, yeah, so I think we can give everybody 7 minutes back if there's no more questions. And we would, of course, encourage people to participate in the essay contest as a mini incentive for everybody to read the materials more, understand, and participate in a deeper discussion, and also share your findings. And please look out for the emails. As we mentioned in the chat a couple of times, sometimes due to unavoidable circumstances, the start timing might change. We do apologize for that, but we will make sure to keep you posted on that. And of course, for the Bengali speaking community, we have a follow-up session tomorrow. Ronie Bhai will share the details on email regarding that as well. And again, really wanted to appreciate everybody for participating and posing all the insightful questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So again, our heartfelt thank you to Professor Dr. Prasanta Pattanaik, sir.
Can I just make one remark?
Yes, of course, sir. Of course.
I would have liked to participate in your Bengali session, but I'm sorry that I can't do that. I understand Bengali, I read Bengali. But in fact, one of my favorite poets is Jivanananda Das. So I read Bengali, but I can't speak Bengali. If I speak Bengali, it will sound like my mother tongue, Odia. So the accent will be completely wrong. So I'm sorry I won't be able to participate in that.
No problem, sir. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for this making this session very vibrant and interesting. And your questions and sir's comments, response, make it a thoroughly enjoyable time. So our next class would be, our next speaker would be Professor Paul Anand. So he will, our next class, next session will be on 20th September. And the date and time, since I am based in Dhaka, Bangladesh, so I always refer to Dhaka time. But please make sure that since you are in different time zones, so please cross-check your local time with announced time. So thank you again, and I think we can conclude here. And thanks everybody, and again deep respect to Professor Pattanaik sir for his wonderful contribution. Thank you. Thank you all, and see you in the next session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot. See you.